This is also a time of change for my family.
Camilla expected the gates to open. They always had. But on this morning, her car slowed outside Windsor. A senior guard stepped forward, and something happened that no one inside the vehicle appeared prepared for. The barrier stayed down. Her access had been suspended. Then came the devastating confirmation. The instruction had come from Charles himself. The woman who had entered Windsor countless times was suddenly being told she could go no farther. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla leaned forward, certain there had been a mistake, but the senior officer did not move aside. Windsor, one of the monarch's principal royal residences and a working center of the crown, was not simply a family home. Access there carried authority, trust, and proximity to the king. That was why the silence at the gate felt brutal. The queen consort asked for clarification, and the answer landed hard. Her name had been removed from that morning's authorized access list. The officer kept his voice controlled, as she demanded that Charles be contacted immediately. Inside the castle, the king received the message, while Anne was already waiting nearby, and for several seconds he said nothing. Then came one answer: no. He would not come to the gate or reverse the order. The Princess Royal watched his face tighten while he turned away, as though the decision had cost him more than anyone outside could see. Camilla pressed again, asking whether the restriction came directly from his private office. The guard confirmed it had arrived before dawn, but refused to explain why. A royal private office is the team handling a senior royal's official instructions, correspondence, and sensitive household decisions, so that detail destroyed any hope of a misunderstanding. Someone had prepared this. Someone had anticipated her arrival. Charles had approved it before she reached Windsor, with terrifying, deliberate finality. William learned of the decision that morning and immediately understood its seriousness. The prince was told only that a major household restriction had been imposed and that he was not to interfere. Anne remained inside with the monarch, making the crisis feel less like a sudden marital argument and more like the consequence of something already examined behind closed doors. Camilla finally sank back as the car turned away. Anger was there, but so was recognition. She knew exactly which recent confrontation Charles might be answering. Because he had not awakened that morning and suddenly decided to close a gate. Something had happened inside Windsor days earlier, and once that hidden confrontation is understood, his devastating "no" begins to make sense. The image was startling, not simply because Camilla had been stopped, but because of who had stopped her. Charles had spent decades defending the woman now waiting outside his own gates. Their relationship had survived scandal, hostility, public judgment, and years when acceptance seemed impossible. That history made his decision far more painful. Windsor was no ordinary address, and this was no ordinary disagreement. Something deeply personal had fractured between them. Charles felt the weight of that fracture long after the car had gone. As sovereign, meaning the monarch who carries the final constitutional and household responsibility of the crown, he could not treat the order as a private quarrel. Guards had witnessed it. Staff had heard about it. The king knew that once a personal dispute reached the security chain, every person inside Windsor would understand that something serious had changed. Camilla felt the same truth from the opposite side. Windsor was more than a residence. It represented belonging, access, and trust at the center of royal life. The queen consort tried Charles again from away from the gates, but the call was not accepted. She lowered the phone, pressed her lips together, and sat in silence. Anger had carried her through the first shock. Now, hurt was taking its place. Charles turned a signet ring slowly between his fingers as Anne sat across from him in a private room. The Princess Royal watched him without interrupting until he finally said, "I never thought we would come to this." He did not sound triumphant. He sounded exhausted. Then he looked at his sister and added, "You saw what happened," Anne answered with a quiet nod, and that simple response made clear that she knew the missing piece. William received his own private briefing soon afterward. The prince was told not to interfere with Windsor's temporary security arrangements, a phrase describing the rules controlling who may enter protected royal spaces. He immediately understood that the decision had been prepared before Camilla reached the gate. This was not anger exploding in the moment. Someone had discussed it, approved it, and expected resistance. Camilla began replaying the previous days in her mind. One evening returned again and again. A tense Windsor meeting, a direct instruction from Charles, and a boundary she had challenged in front of others. The Queen knew that if this was what he was answering, then the gate had merely been the consequence. And that evening would become the point everyone inside the family quietly traced the crisis back to. The moment when a disagreement over influence became, in Charles's eyes, an unforgivable challenge to his authority, with consequences neither of them could easily escape. 3 evenings before the Windsor gates closed, the palace still appeared calm. Yet behind a private door, Charles and Camilla entered an argument that would change everything. It began over access. Who could enter a restricted royal working area? Who could authorize advisors? And whose instructions household staff were expected to follow? By the time Anne entered the dispute, the issue was no longer procedure. It had become a battle over who ultimately had the right to say no. Charles had felt the pressure building for weeks. Staff instructions were being questioned, invitations were being adjusted, and decisions he believed settled were returning to his desk in altered form. A restricted royal working area means a protected part of a residence where sensitive official business is handled and entry is limited to approved people. To the king, those boundaries were not about pride. They existed because confused authority could leave staff unsure whose order they were expected to obey. Camilla saw something very different. She believed every new restriction pushed her farther from meaningful influence, reducing her to a ceremonial presence whose voice mattered only when someone else approved it. The Queen told Charles privately that she would not spend her life asking permission before every serious decision. He listened, but the argument hardened. What she experienced as exclusion, he increasingly viewed as resistance to clear limits. The breaking point came that evening. Camilla instructed Windsor staff to admit a private advisor into the protected working area, even though Charles had explicitly ordered that no outside advisor enter that night. Anne discovered the visitor waiting inside and immediately demanded to know who had authorized the access. The Princess Royal then sent word to her brother, knowing the instruction she had heard earlier could not have been clearer. Charles entered moments later and looked directly at Camilla. He asked one question: why had his order been ignored? She replied that she should not need his permission for every household decision, and insisted the situation had been misunderstood. The king slowly placed the pen in his hand onto the table. When I give a direct instruction here, it is not optional. Anne broke the silence. She told Camilla there had been no confusion because she had personally heard Charles state the restriction that afternoon. The Queen's anger deepened, but the documented household review that followed made the problem worse. It recorded several earlier occasions when staff had received conflicting directions from the couple, convincing the monarch that Windsor's chain of authority had become dangerously blurred. Camilla left furious. Charles remained with Anne, asked for the Windsor access list, and instructed his private staff to remove one name temporarily before morning. The gate incident was never the beginning. It was the consequence. And when she finally confronted him face to face, all that contained anger would become painfully personal. Hours after being turned away, Camilla finally gains the private meeting she demanded, but not at Windsor. There are no photographers, no ceremonial smiles, and no aides seated between them. Charles enters knowing exactly what she wants. She enters already furious. For several seconds, neither speaks. Then she asks the question that has been burning since the gates closed. How could the man who defended her for decades allow guards to treat her like an outsider? Charles chooses the location carefully, because the Windsor security order is still active, and he refuses to let their marriage interfere with it. A standing order is a formal instruction that remains in force until it is changed or cancelled, and this one still carries his authority. Camilla arrives with one aide, the king with another. But both assistants leave before the conversation begins. The queen wants no witnesses. He wants no excuses. Camilla does not hesitate. "You humiliated me in front of your own guards." Charles absorbs the accusation without interrupting. She demands an apology, but he answers with something colder. "The humiliation," he says, "did not begin at the gate. It began when she ignored his instruction inside Windsor and forced staff to choose which royal voice they were supposed to obey." The king keeps his tone controlled, and that restraint makes every word cut deeper. Charles then draws the line he believes their marriage blurred. He tells Camilla that loyalty gave them intimacy, trust, and partnership, but it never erased institutional boundaries. The queen argues that those boundaries increasingly feel like walls being built around her. He replies that a marriage cannot function if one partner treats every limit as an insult, while a monarchy cannot function if household authority becomes negotiable whenever emotions rise. Camilla presses harder. She asks whether Anne pushed him into the decision. Charles refuses to hide behind his sister. He says the Princess Royal confirmed what happened during the disputed Windsor meeting, but the final order was his alone. Camilla hears the distinction clearly. Anne witnessed the breach, but the king chose the punishment. Charles then delivers the deeper blow. The restriction does not concern one gate. Certain private working areas, staff instructions, and household authorizations are also temporarily beyond Camilla's control. She stares at him, finally understanding that this is not merely anger. Camilla reaches the door, then turns back. She asks whether he is calming a crisis or permanently changing her place inside the royal household. Charles waits too long before answering. That silence tells her enough. She entered fighting to reopen a gate. She leaves realizing the real battle is over who has the power to define her role. When marriage, monarchy, and authority collide. The most powerful moment did not happen outside Windsor, or during the argument with Camilla. It happened afterward, when Charles was alone with the written security instruction carrying his authorization. He could have withdrawn it. He could have softened the language, restored access, and allowed the palace machine to erase the embarrassment. Instead, he picked up his pen, read the recommendation again, and confirmed the restriction. That second decision mattered more than the first. Charles understood exactly what his signature would do. A household security measure is a formal rule controlling access, permissions, and protected spaces inside a royal residence. And once approved, it becomes something guards and staff must follow consistently. The king reviewed every line, describing what Camilla could enter, which instructions she could issue, and where additional approval would now be required. This mattered, because uncertainty at Windsor was no longer merely uncomfortable. It had become a risk to the chain of command. Anne watched him pause over Camilla's name. The Princess Royal did not push him toward either choice. Instead, she asked the question he had been avoiding. Was he still acting from anger, or did he truly believe the monarchy required this boundary? Charles looked at the paper again before answering that anger would have made him reverse everything once the heat had passed. Responsibility, he said, was the reason he could not. William received the updated briefing soon afterward. The prince was told that Camilla's access had been limited, but her public standing remained unchanged. He could have treated that distinction as an opportunity to weaken her further. Instead, he made clear that he would not use the crisis to settle old emotional grievances. The future king wanted order restored, not another family war, and his restraint gave Charles confidence that the decision would not automatically split the household into hostile camps. Camilla learned the harsher truth through the new rules themselves. Her rank still carried public importance, but it no longer guaranteed unrestricted authority over every residence, protected room, or staff function. The Queen could still perform her duties, yet some decisions now required approval from the King's office. That difference was subtle on paper and devastating in practice. The change spread quickly. Staff members who once acted on Camilla's instructions without hesitation began asking which office had formally cleared them. She noticed the pause before answers. She noticed the requests for confirmation. And she understood that the closed Windsor gate had changed far more than one morning's access. One barrier had sent a ripple through the entire household, and the next blow would not come through another argument. It would come through silence, altered loyalties, and the painful realization that people were beginning to behave differently around her. Power rarely disappears with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it disappears in smaller ways. A phone call that takes longer to return, an aide who suddenly asks for written confirmation, a door that once opened automatically but now requires clearance. That is how the new reality reaches Camilla. The Windsor confrontation is over, yet its consequences are only beginning. And for the first time, she understands that Charles's decision has changed not just where she can go, but how everyone responds to her. Camilla feels the shift immediately. Household employees have been told that requests affecting restricted Windsor areas must now pass through the King's office, meaning the team responsible for approving the monarch's household instructions. Nobody challenges the Queen openly. Nobody needs to. The pauses are enough. Her public engagements continue. Her ceremonial duties remain. But the freedom she once took for granted has narrowed. Camilla tests the new reality when she asks an aide to rearrange a Windsor meeting. The aide hesitates, then says, "Written approval from Charles's office is required before anything can change." She stares at the staff member for several seconds. Pride tells her to push back. Exhaustion wins. "I understand," she says, and the words sound heavier than any argument. Charles receives a briefing later that day, stating that Camilla has cancelled a private visit rather than ask for authorization. The King closes the folder and does not speak at first. Then he asks one quiet question: "Is she all right?" His concern does not undo the restriction, but it exposes the cost. He wanted clarity, not cruelty, and now the distance between them is becoming impossible to ignore. William refuses to let that distance become a family war. The prince makes clear that he will not join any household attempt to turn the crisis into competing camps. Sophie takes the same position when staff try to draw her into the dispute. The trusted confidant insists that loyalty does not require choosing one royal against another, and her restraint helps prevent the tension from spreading further. Anne makes an unexpected move of her own. The Princess Royal sends Camilla a private message asking to meet without aides present. She refuses at first, convinced that Charles's sister helped create her humiliation. Yet the invitation unsettles her, because Anne is not celebrating. She is reaching out. Charles speaks to William that evening and finally says what he wants. He does not want Camilla defeated. He wants something harder. A conversation where neither crown nor title can hide them from the truth. And that meeting would shift everything away from gates and rules, because he was finally ready to say what anger had kept buried. This time there are no guards nearby, no advisors waiting outside with folders, and no argument over who controls Windsor. Charles and Camilla meet simply as husband and wife. The anger that dominated their previous confrontation has burned itself down to exhaustion. He speaks first. What he says changes the meaning of the entire crisis. He did not close the gate because he wanted her gone. He closed it because he feared neither of them knew where their private partnership ended anymore. Charles makes one thing clear before Camilla can argue about access again. No security decision will be negotiated during this conversation. The king wants to speak about their marriage, not the household chain of command, which simply means the formal line showing whose instructions staff must follow. She prepares to defend herself, but he stops her gently. He tells her that setting limits is not the same as asking her to surrender her dignity. Charles then admits what anger had hidden. Years of surviving scandal and standing together had made boundaries feel almost unnatural between them. But the monarch says his greatest fear was not losing control of a room. It was watching staff become trapped between the sovereign and his wife, uncertain whose instruction carried final authority. He tells Camilla that once that happened, both their marriage and the institution around them would begin to suffer. Camilla finally stops fighting the central point. She admits that allowing the advisor into the restricted Windsor area after Charles had said no was wrong. The Queen does not describe it as confusion anymore. She acknowledges that she challenged him in front of staff because she wanted to prove that her voice still mattered. Saying it aloud changes the room. For the first time, responsibility replaces accusation. Camilla then explains the fear beneath the defiance. Every new restriction had felt like another sign that she was being slowly pushed toward irrelevance. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, and the idea of becoming merely decorative terrified her. What Charles saw as a struggle for power, she says, was partly panic about losing the place she had worked so hard to secure. Charles does not offer instant forgiveness. He also refuses permanent exile. The king tells her Windsor access will not simply return as though nothing happened, but trust can be rebuilt through responsibilities they both understand. Charles opens the door himself when the conversation ends. Camilla pauses beside him, and neither tries to win. But private reconciliation cannot erase what the country has already seen. A queen stopped at a royal gate, a king refusing to intervene, and a family crisis about to become a national spectacle. By the next morning, the private meaning of the dispute barely matters outside palace walls. Britain sees something simpler and far more explosive. Camilla was stopped at Windsor, and Charles refused to let her through. The story dominates conversation because the symbolism is impossible to miss. A closed gate has become a portrait of royal division. Yet while commentators search for winners and losers, the people at the center of the storm know the reality is far more painful. Camilla watches the coverage build and feels the story slipping beyond her control. Broadcasters lead with the confrontation, while commentators argue over whether it signals marital collapse, household discipline, or a dramatic assertion of royal authority. The royal household, meaning the staff and offices supporting the monarch and senior family members, issues only a tightly controlled acknowledgement that internal access arrangements remain a private operational matter. The Queen hears the statement and knows its restraint will not stop the speculation. Camilla sees the gate moment replayed again and again until she finally switches the television off. She has spent years surviving criticism, public judgment, and questions about her place beside Charles. Now all of that history has been reduced to one brutal image of rejection. The Queen knows she crossed a boundary, yet watching the country turn her humiliation into spectacle leaves her wounded in a way the private argument never did. Charles reacts differently when an aide places the morning headlines before him. The king visibly winces at the language and quietly admits that he wanted order restored inside Windsor, not his wife publicly shamed. He does not withdraw the decision. Still, the coverage forces him to confront something harder. A necessary boundary can cause damage, even when the reason behind it remains valid. The public mood crystallizes along Windsor's long walk, the broad approach leading toward the castle, where visitors gather with morning newspapers in hand. One front page dominates attention with two enormous words: "Barred at Windsor." People stop beneath the very residence at the center of the crisis, turning one family dispute into a national symbol. William refuses the easiest conclusion. The prince tells those around him privately that accountability does not automatically mean permanent fracture, and reconciliation does not erase responsibility. His words reach Charles, strengthening the king's belief that punishment cannot become the final chapter. Charles summons Camilla once more. This time he carries a written framework defining their household roles from that day forward. The world has delivered its sensational verdict. Now they must decide whether the closed gate represents destruction or the boundary that finally saves what remains between them. The ending is not a dramatic victory for Charles, nor a humiliating defeat for Camilla. It is quieter and far more consequential. Days after the image of the closed Windsor gate shocks the monarchy, the two sit together, one final time. Between them is a short written agreement defining responsibilities, access, and authority. Nobody raises a voice. Nobody threatens to leave, because both now understand the lesson the crisis forced upon them. Love cannot survive when every boundary is treated as betrayal. Charles reads the final arrangement carefully before placing it between them. The agreement creates a clear chain of authorization, meaning a defined order showing which royal office has final power over security decisions, protected working areas, and staff instructions. The king restores Camilla's normal Windsor access, but the rules that caused the crisis are no longer blurred. Her public duties remain intact. Her position remains intact. What changes is the assumption that personal closeness automatically brings unrestricted institutional control. Charles looks at Camilla and acknowledges something he had resisted saying. Blocking her at the gate was necessary in that moment, he explains. But the public humiliation went further than he intended. The monarch does not withdraw the decision or pretend it caused no pain. She listens, then admits her own mistake. The Queen accepts that deliberately overriding his Windsor instruction crossed a line, while explaining that fear of becoming irrelevant had pushed her to fight for influence instead of confronting that fear directly. Anne meets Camilla afterward, and the conversation changes another relationship damaged by the crisis. The Princess Royal tells her privately that she never wanted her removed from the family. She wanted one boundary protected. Staff could never again be placed between competing commands. Camilla finally understands that Anne's resistance was not necessarily personal, and the two women leave the confrontation without warmth restored completely, but without hostility controlling them either. Camilla returns to Windsor, knowing the moment will carry meaning. The same barrier that once remained closed now rises, and the senior guard gives the customary acknowledgement. She pauses before proceeding. There is no triumph in that return. There is recognition. The gate has reopened, but she knows the old assumptions behind it have not. Charles's no was never ultimately a declaration that Camilla no longer belonged. It became a declaration that belonging could not mean unlimited authority. Her return proved accountability did not require abandonment, while his refusal to erase every consequence proved reconciliation did not require surrender. The gate reopened, but the old arrangement never did. Charles protected the boundary he believed the crown required. Camilla confronted the fear beneath her struggle for control, and their marriage survived because both finally understood that loyalty without limits could destroy the relationship they were desperate to preserve. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.